And now we bring you Killer Wise, episode 29, Preacher Man. These are the case facts against Miss Emma Rain, who had her husband assassinated. Isn't trust a bitch? New Orleans, Louisiana, made famous for Mardi Gras, Bourbon Street, but also made famous for the murder of one Mr. Ernest Smith.
Sergeant Central. 19 Sergeant. You have a callback for 86 Central? Negative K, nothing further. Just see the cabbie on the corner.
Every bad storm has a tendency to drive black widows from their hiding places. And in Louisiana, there was a very big storm brewing on the horizon. Mayor Ray Nagin had already issued evacuation orders for everyone that was going to leave town. The remaining residents who had ridden out storms before decided to shelter in place, just like Miss Emma Rain and her second husband. On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina would make landfall in Louisiana near Beers Triumph, a tiny town of about 3,500 people. This storm, unlike so many others, would end up being devastating to the southern coast of the United States. Hurricane Katrina was a huge storm, with a very expansive wind field compared to an average weather event. Storm surges along the leading edge of the coast were 24 to 28 feet high and caused a civil engineering disaster as never seen before or since in America. Levees and flood walls collapsed at many critical locations, and 80% of New Orleans was flooded. But with passage of time and the help of the Army Corps of Engineers, New Orleans was pumped dry in order to begin the long and arduous journey back to normalcy. Residents would slowly trickle back in, and stores that were totally destroyed would take many years to come back. But for the tougher residents like Pastor Ernest Smith and wife Emma Rain, who refused to take his last name, would stick it out. New Orleans, like many other cities along the Gulf Coast after Katrina, would become a waterlogged, lawless mess for authorities to manage. Over several months following the disaster, police officers struggled to maintain law and order, and looting flourished along with people who wanted to use the guise of the storm to settle old scores and to commit murder. Criminals in this type of environment knew that police had developed disaster blind spots and that they were understaffed. Even almost a year after the disaster, to investigate a murder took great effort. Between mountains of debris and blocked off deserted neighborhoods, police had a patchwork of patrol routes to maintain. But neighborhoods stuck it out, and many minute enough to participate in events that began to represent normalcy. Or so it was on the last day of Ernest Smith's life. Ernest, the pastor of a church of some 500 persons before the disaster, would spend the entire sunny day with his best friend until late at night at Bike Night in Jefferson Parish. It's 11:30 p.m. on a quiet April night, and Ernest Smith now has less than 2 hours remaining to live. Unbeknownst to him, the most prominent black widow that ever graced the country of the United States of America has just signed his death warrant. Earlier that week, Ernest's wife had contracted a man by the name of James, who she'd been having an affair with, to have someone kill the preacher. That's a good wife, right? Now, although James did not want to commit the crime himself, he had someone who was closer to him to do the dirty deed, and more importantly, keep his mouth shut about that deed. If everything went to plan, Emma and James could finally be together as a married couple after her husband's death. But only if her new lover James knew that this particular black widow had developed a pattern. Now, this woman had a pattern of inviting men into her life, marrying them, and then murdering them. Emma's first husband entrusted his life into her hands back in 1994, when a car out of nowhere purposely hit him, drug his body quite the distance, and then kept on going. Yes, Leroy survived that assassination attempt only to end up a paraplegic that would have to lean upon his murderous wife for everything he needed in life. He could no longer care for himself. At that point in time, Emma pretended to play the role of the supporting wife. I'm here for you. What can I do for you? She should have said, what can I do to you? She did this just long enough to throw Leroy or anyone who was watching off from her original intent. The man she paid to run over and kill Leroy had failed miserably, but Emma had no intentions of missing her mark the second go around. Now, as a paraplegic, Leroy was left breathing and eating through a tube just to be able to survive. If he could not get the nutrition or oxygen he needed, he would certainly be in trouble. And she knew that. And she put this in her next plans to take Leroy's life. One night after a meal, Leroy's feeding tube was not removed from his throat, causing him to choke violently until the moment he died. But his wife was in that apartment at the time. Now, although he and Emma were the only persons in the residence, she was never charged with his death or neglect of another human being, especially neglect of your own spouse. As a result, Emma was able to collect the money associated with Leroy's life insurance policy and moved on to her next male victim. Which brings us back to the moment that the minister was being targeted for assassination by his very wife. He was the next victim, or the man she married shortly after killing her first husband. This was her pattern, and she was running her pattern like a video game to the letter. The man she contracted to kill the preacher was Mr. Alfred Everett. Alfred Everett is the brother of James, the undercover lover of the preacher's wife. Wow, they have a style of keeping everything in the family. Now, this particular night, Everett sat quietly in a darkened car, waiting to return to the preacher, to whom his wife forwarded his schedule. So he knew everything about the preacher, what time he was going home, where he had went that particular night. And once the preacher arrived home, as she said he would, Everett crouched low in his vehicle as to not draw attention to himself. He didn't want to. He wanted this particular murder to be a surprise in order to minimize any counterattack that the preacher might have against him.
You're watching MNN, the Men's Channel.
I mean, after all, Emma had promised to pay him $100,000 if he didn't screw this particular murder up. That's a lot of money. Now, tonight, her husband Ernest would have a short reprieve for his life, though. He came home, and a fellow of a biker who returned, and he wanted, like a friend, to blabber on incessantly. You know how friends are, so they just kept on and on talking. This extended his life. But once that friend parted the curb to leave, the killer, tired of waiting in the car, sprang from his car with a 9mm automatic pistol in his right hand. He placed the muzzle of that pistol into Ernest's chest and shot him 3 times at point-blank range before Ernest could even react. Now, as Ernest stumbled, he knew he was mortally wounded. The killer got into his car, screeched his tires, and got the hell out of there. Simultaneously, in the window upstairs, Ernest's wife watched in earnest as her plans for her husband's demise were being carried out to the letter. She was happy that she'd get him on the first go-around, not like her first husband where the accident didn't get him. Now at first, Emma believed that Ernest would drop dead where he stood. But to her amazement, he ran up the stairs towards the apartment where they lived. She didn't know why. Did he miss his target? Now once he peeked the top of the stairs, he had sufficiently bled out enough and he collapsed and died. What Emma did next was as baffling to the detectives as it was to me today. Emma's first call after shooting was not to 911, no, but to a close friend of her husband's. She then ran downstairs, pretending to be a scared widow by locking herself in a truck and refusing to speak to anyone while detectives cased the area for the murder. Little did they know, she knew who that murder was. Now, while all this drama was being played out like a soap opera, Everett the killer drove back to Mississippi where he lived, and along the way, tossed the murder weapon out of the car window while crossing Lake Pontchartrain Bridge. Now, that gun would never be recovered during the subsequent investigation. They would not be able to find it. Now, not because they didn't do a good job looking for it, but he didn't say specifically where that gun was tossed. Now, after the falsely distraught Emma called 911 to report her husband was shot that night, the detectives who arrived found it odd that Emma Rain didn't have a spot of blood on her body anywhere. Now, usually a loved one will try to embrace or soothe a mortally wounded spouse in their time of need. So in this guy's worst time of need, somebody who he had as a spouse for years, you did not get covered in blood. Now, when he asked where she was during the shooting, Emma responded with one of the lamest excuses anyone could ever give at a horrific crime scene. Emma told police that she had a toothache. Not only a toothache, that she was sleeping in her room when she heard the gunshots ring out. But detectives noticed at that scene that Emma was not wearing pajamas. Now, why was this essential? Everybody doesn't go to bed with pajamas. Now, not wearing pajamas, although she had them in her drawer. If she had just gotten out of bed, as she told officers she did, why was she fully dressed and on the run? Did she take time to get dressed? Now, also something else was completely off about the behavior of a wife whose husband had just been murdered. You see, usually at a homicide scene, family members show up crying. They can't believe it. Oh, look what's happened. And upset. But in Emma's case, there was no hysteria at all. After the shooting of Ernest Smith, no hysteria, no crying, no sobbing, which is normally the case when a wife has her husband killed. Now, detectives noticed of her clothing that there was not a drop of blood, like I said, indicating that she did not render any assistance to her dying spouse. Now, this behavior is usually indicative of someone who would sit back and observe a stranger dying, you see, rather than an exhibited person who wanted to give compassion to their spouse. Now, many years later at her trial, her lawyer covered his client's blood-free clothing with this excuse. He gave an explanation for his client's behavior and a reason she wasn't covered in his blood. He said she held his head in her arms. See, she held her head in his arm just like I'm doing right now. And she asked him what would happen and did not touch his bloody chest. I don't think it's normally to ask somebody with gunshot wounds to the chest what happened. Now, moreover, he said Emma Rain suspected the friend who went back after the bike night with her husband might have been involved. Now, since that man came back to the crime scene, she was acting cautious and closed off because she wanted to get away. You see, she was afraid that that man would be the murderer. But she actually knew who was the murderer. She had contracted that murder. She said she felt that she was in the company of the man who was responsible for his death. Now, this was from her lawyer. But these are the words that any lawyer would give to their client, even if that client was Charles Manson himself. You cover your client. But in this case, murder alone was not the motive. Insurance was. She wanted the money, as many killer wives do. Now, since the beginning of her marriage to the preacher, Emma Rain periodically bumped up the value of the insurance policy she purchased on her husband's life. So she got the life insurance. She got him to validate it, but she got the life insurance. She bought the original policy for $100,000 in the year 1997. And she incrementally increased the policy to an $800,000 payout by the year 2005. $800,000. But she encountered a major hiccup in her plan when Emma learned that her dead husband's daughter would be the automatic beneficiary according to Louisiana state law. To get the money, Emma originated a plan whereby she would get her own biological daughter to pose as her dead husband's biological daughter in order to get the beneficiary's money. But because insurance carriers don't usually resolve million-dollar payouts based purely off of visual identification, she knew she was in trouble. Now, due to this hole in Emma's plan, her daughter was caught and arrested on forgery charges. You see, you can't just go in and pretend you're somebody else. But Emma went free after the incident and shortly thereafter collected the entire insurance policy anyway and married her lover that set up the whole murder incident. So, with the spoils of war from Ernest's insurance policy, Emma built a mansion for herself and her co-conspirator. But as I mentioned to you earlier, Emma was one of the worst black widows in the United States of America, and there has not been a woman this devious since. Only 5 years after profiting off of her dead husband, this particular black widow sharpened her fangs again and prepared to strike at another person closest to her. Watch out. In the year 2011, James Rain, her new husband at the age of 37, was found shot to death at his house in Poplarville, Mississippi, in the exact same manner her second husband had been killed. Same MO. When these women commit these particular murders for insurance, that's what they do. They don't change up. So James Rain was found shot to death just outside of the couple's house, which was described as a mansion with TVs in just about every room, presumably purchased with the money from the insurance payout from Smith's death. So from the second husband, she paid for the spoils to give to the third husband, who she shortly killed. And had James Rain not been killed in Pearl River County, Mississippi, Emma might never have faced charges in her second husband's death in New Orleans. She ran the murders too close together. They knew to get her at that point. But the case had gone cold for years. But Emma once again collected insurance money from the death of her third husband. And then she went into her final habitual trait, and that was to get married once again. So this makes 4 marriages for this woman. 4 marriages. If 3 of your husbands die, I would not be the 4th guy. Now Emma married her 4th and final husband. But it was only after Emma Rain's third husband, the trigger man's brother, was shot dead that Everett, the killer of her second husband, confided to some of his relatives about his role in the murder of her second husband. He was very close to him. And she should have never shot. Or had the third guy shot, it pissed the second guy off. So after James Rain was killed, his brother was distraught. It would seem that Emma had made her worst mistake because Everett broke down, crying to his uncles and cousin, admitting Emma Rain and his brother commissioned him to kill her previous husband. And he said, "I'm scared to death." So he thought she would maybe come after him. That was his statement. Everett made to his uncle and his cousins. He did not want her coming after him. He told him that he was contracted by Ernest Smith and they would give him $100,000. But all Everett ended up getting was a couple of clunkers, or what you call old cars. She reneged on that deal, but she kept the bulk of the money. Everett was advised by his family to turn himself in. When he didn't, one of the relatives called the New Orleans Police Department and asked for a homicide detective. Now, everybody's about to get in trouble. Now, it wasn't until James Rain's death that his relatives grew suspicious about Emma Rain. So, if it wasn't the first 2 deaths, that last one triggered it. They had long suspected her involvement in Smith's death, and now they began to think she might have killed Rain also for the life insurance. I wouldn't think it, I'd know it. 3 guys in a row, 3 insurance payments in a row, this chick did it. Now, eventually the family contacted the Senator Baines, a New Orleans police detective who specializes in cold case applications. Now, because of this, Everett was arrested in Galveston County, Texas in July 2013, where he had fled to. He was extradited to New Orleans and charged with killing Smith. Emma Raines herself was arrested in August 2013 in Jackson County, Mississippi, where she had went to. She was returned to New Orleans and charged with second-degree murder and the criminal conspiracy. For the first time, they caught this woman in a long time. Now, had this been a guy who did all his murders, they would have caught him the first time. The jury convicted Rain of second-degree murder. Rain also remained a suspect in the 2011 murder of James Rain, who was shot dead at the mansion she had built in Poplarville. Now, with the insurance policy firmly in hand and proceeds from Smith's death, her second husband, the prosecutor in the case testified that Emma, who was in a business trip in Arkansas, so after the third husband was killed, she went on a business trip to Arkansas when James Rain was killed. And she promptly got drunk and had sex the day after she learned the news. Now, that is a very caring wife. This time she wasn't even at the scene. Now, it is my belief that she had not been arrested and tried and imprisoned, she would be at casket shopping the next day to bury that particular guy and get more insurance. For Killer Wives, this is Charles Rivers. Thank you for joining us.